Uncharted is directed by Ruben Fleischer and stars Tom Holland, Mark Wahlberg, and among others. In this story, it deals with a young bartender named Nathan Drake, who's played by Tom Holland, ends up meeting a guy named Victor Sullivan, also known as Sully, and he ends up going with him on this journey in order to find the treasure of the Magellan expedition. And it's a race against time as they're simply trying to get to it before Antonio Banderas' character is also after it. Now, here's a little backstory. Now, this is a film that has been in development for a while, and it's based on the series of popular video games that were from the PlayStation 3 era all the way up until recently. And I've just always been a fan of the actual Uncharted series because growing up, they were always one of those kind of franchises that really put a lot of emphasis on being a more cinematic experience in its own right, as telling basically it's like watching a movie. And a lot of the different gameplay mechanics and a lot of the different ways that the characters interact with each other and the various twists and turns and a lot of the great adventurous feel that the games had really brought me into a whole nother level that was like the modern day Indiana Jones. And I just really got a really kick out of the game so much to where I still to this day need to play the fourth. I still need to finish the fourth game because I still haven't finished it yet for Thiessen. But when the first game came out, there were talks of actually doing the movie for quite a while, and there were actually rumors that, there were actually casting decisions that were including Nathan Fillion. I believe Jensen Ackles' name was also rumored as well, and you also had like some other well-known names that were going to possibly play Sully, including Woody Harrelson, Jake Gyllenhaal, and among others. And I really felt like as the years went on that, to me, I think if they were going to have some like perfect spot-on casting, if it was going to be making them, if it was made like maybe a few years ago or maybe nowadays still, I would really love to see. Well, if it was like maybe 10 years ago, I could have maybe seen Nathan Fillion and probably Bruce Campbell as Nathan Drake and Sully, because I really feel like their personality and their charisma on screen in a lot of films really would have been like perfect casting altogether. And so when news came around that they were actually finally getting a movie to do this one, there actually was a casting choice with Mark Wahlberg originally as Drake for a while. But then after those plans fell through, he ended up basically got too old to where he ended up pretty much having to come in to play the role of Sully. And that's really the only thing I was going into it with kind of just very mild skepticism, because I didn't really feel like, Mark Wahlberg really captured like the very kind of older type of wiser kind of guy approach that you would see from the games. Because from what I also heard was that this film was also trying to be an origin story to the actual games itself as a prequel. And so I felt like going into it, I just wasn't really keen on seeing Mark Wahlberg, but I was still keen on seeing Tom Holland play Drake. And I think that from the trailers and from the casting alone, I think that he probably could have still been a good choice. I think that he still was a good choice to play Nathan Drake, because I think that Tom Holland does capture a lot of great humor in a lot of his films, and he does, from the trailers and from after seeing the film, I think that he was still right for the role. And we would later see what Drake would be like in the later games with his early witty humor and everything. And so, after upon seeing the film, I can honestly say that the movie was fun, but it definitely has a lot of problems, and it holds it back from being a really great video game adaptation, and it strays some things that are very, from the games a lot. But at the same time, it did feel like it was a good, fun, adventurous film for me, to where I was still able to appreciate stuff they incorporated from the games, while also looking at it as its own kind of movie, to where I still felt like I was getting into that fun type of, adventurous Indiana Jones, type of vibe. And while this movie is nowhere and never reach the heights of those classic movies of Indiana Jones and all things, or even National Treasure, I still think that it still was a good time. To get my pros out of the way, I'll say that Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg, I thought were pretty good. Like, they were actually good together and had great chemistry. They had some really fun humor that I enjoyed. And while I still wasn't a big fan of Mark Wahlberg's the way that he portrayed Sully in the film, I still thought that his chemistry with Tom Holland is what really kept it going for me. And I like that they're able to still bring a lot of their still like charm in a lot of scenes together. And Tom Holland, I got to really give credit for it as well, because I know a lot of people have said that he was miscast for Drake, but I really think that he brought it to his all, and I think that he was able to bring a lot of stuff that was relevant for Drake to the games that I enjoyed. Some of his witty humor, a lot of his, some of his wit, and the way that he is able to kind of go along with things. And there's even points that, not going to go into detail, but the way that he kind of, picks up on certain things to later, like, backfire events that happen, I thought was pretty clever with that, with his character. And so I thought he was great, and he really works a lot well in the action department as well with it. And you got to think this is also Tom Holland's big foray into doing a more standalone action film. Well, not standalone, but a different foray into playing an action hero compared to Spider-Man. Because while there is a whole lot of CGI present in a lot of scenes, it does show that, and I read from behind the scenes that it was a lot of more dangerous stuff and a lot more hard stuff that he had to handle doing some of the action stunts and everything behind the scenes when he was doing the movie compared to what he did in Spider-Man. So I appreciate that he really wanted to really balance himself more out and playing a more different type of character than what we're seeing with Peter Parker. And so I thought he was great, and I also really enjoyed the way that the movie does have a very fun, adventurous vibe with capturing stuff from the games, including the locations they go to, and one of the things I really appreciate that they bring in from the games is how they do some of the puzzle solving. That while it can be very redundant and very deviating from other movies, including National Treasure, I still thought it really carried the flow of the movie pretty well, and there has something to do with these keys that they use, and when they're unlocking things, I thought it was pretty I thought it still captured the game's spirit in that regard. And and one of my other biggest things I got to appreciate too is the movie is very fast paced, and it does have some very good set pieces, especially toward the third act that I thought really captured a lot, that reminded me a lot of the games. And it really puts a lot of emphasis of having the way director Ruben Fleischer captures the action scenes, and the way that it's very choreographed with some of the fights. And there's very good, fun, it's just a very fun vibe the way it's created with these set pieces in the third act. I won't go into detail, but let's just say it definitely had me something that I was kind of like, it was very odd, but at the same time it made me smile throughout it because it was just very fascinating to watch. And so, to get my other pros out of the way, I will say too that Antonio Banderas I did like as the villain, but I did feel like his villain was underutilized, and he wasn't really given a whole lot much to do in the movie necessarily. But I still thought he was still good. And then I also liked the girl they bring in that plays Chloe. I thought she was great as well. I will say that this is kind of getting to more of my cons, where as much fun as I had with the movie and the way that it was, played out, as far as getting into stuff that involves the writing is where it holds it back from being great. And the biggest issue I have is, being an avid fan of the games, the motivation that's behind this, I can see a lot of the issues with it, because it really seems like the way that it's motivated for Drake to go on this journey, it seemed to me that it was not really something I think was really strong the way it went along. And there's a lot of stuff that happens throughout the film where things happen conveniently, and there's a lot of twists and turns that are going back and forth that, not going to go into detail, but let's just say that if you've seen, for example, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, there's a character in that film that does certain things, and the motivations that a lot of the traits that character had in that movie is kind of falls into with this one as well, from what I also seen. And so the way the plot goes along, it felt like we were just not really. It seemed like a lot of things that were happening were very happening out of coincidence, and there also really wasn't. It didn't really make me feel like the characters' motivations were quite on that grass compared to what they are in the games and everything. And so I thought that was very lacking. And it also, like we were saying earlier with Antonio Banderas' character, is like I like him as the villain. It's just that there's some stuff that they bring in that I think was just so very predictable of his character. And it's very cliche in the way that it plays along, because he deals with a lot of very cliche villain type of stuff that involves with his family and everything that I think we've seen so many times before. And so that really kind of dragged it down. I think to get into some other problems I had with Mark Wahlberg as the character is the fact that he really doesn't come across as very Sully as he is from the actual games, because it feels more like Wahlberg is trying to essentially play more like a more older Drake, and his type of, his attitude throughout the movie, his way that he plays these kind of characters, it just really feels like it's out of place, and it would feel more fitting if he was actually playing Drake. Now, if you would have had somebody like Bruce Campbell, or hell, even Woody Harrelson playing this kind of role, and playing the more kind of mentor figure like in his early years. I could have probably bought that a little bit more because it just felt like the stuff that they really try to make with the whole trying with Sully trying to bring Drake on his journey. I didn't really buy too much with how they were going along with it as far as the writing aspect. And then on top of that, there's also some very noticeable CGI at times that I did feel was very questionable and just kind of like cringy. Not too much, but there were a couple points I'm like, yeah, that looks pretty that looks pretty green screen there. And then there's also, like, as far as direction wise, there were a couple times where some of the fight scenes could be having like quick cuts a couple times that looked very off in certain areas. And on top of that, there was some other things that, while I get why they did it for the game, it really felt like the movie wasn't really consistent if they were trying to make it really more as its own canon, or if it's actually trying to be a straight-on prequel to the games. Because one of the things I did notice that strays from the games is the fact that you have essentially a, you have the scene where they're on the plane, and that's the same kind of iconic moment that takes place in the third game. Now, if this would have been probably went on a different direction where they could have made a twist on it, it probably would have worked a lot better for it and actually made it, follow the actual events from the games in canon. But I think that the way they were trying to do is like they couldn't decide whether or not they wanted to keep the movie as its own continuity or if they wanted to make it a straight-on prequel. Because if this is meant to be a straight-on prequel, it really doesn't make sense how you would have Drake pretty much going through the same shit twice from the movie all the way to the third game. And so I think that was one of the things where it felt like it was very inconsistent with its structure and the way that the plot goes along. But overall, though, I will say that as much as some of the stuff that they stray from the games on, I do still got a really kick out of it because I appreciate they still put effort into trying to follow the games type of adventure style and everything. And while the story could have been a whole lot better, there is some, hope that maybe if this movie does well, and so far it's doing well, that if they do end up doing the sequel, they'll probably follow more closer to the games than what we have so far. So with that being said, I will say that since I was more entertained with it, more than it had credit for, it's not a great adaptation of the video games, but I still think it was still a fun movie. So with that, I'm going to give the movie a high average Joe on the Film Freaks meter. So for those of you who have also seen Uncharted and also played the other video games as well, let me know in the comments below what you thought about it. And thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.